Welcome to the Hope After Child Loss podcast, where we endeavor to offer stories of hope to grieving parents and siblings so that they might rediscover life filled with meaning, purpose, and hope. We invite you to come and join us. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Hope After Child Loss. I'm your host, Greg Buffkin, and we are so glad that you could join us today. Guys, I'm excited to introduce our guest today. He is the senior pastor of Hands of Faith Church in Zanesville, Ohio, that he and his wife Kathy founded. He is also president of Miles's Mission, a nonprofit founded in honor of his grandson Miles, who we'll be talking about shortly. And Michael is also an author whose most recent book is entitled Even Now I Know, A Journey from Grief to Gratitude. Some of you who were listening to the last episode will realize somewhere during this episode that Michael's daughter, Jennifer Bullock-Moore, is Miles's mom and is the anchor of the NBC News affiliate there in Zanesville. Is that right?
Columbus.
In Columbus. Yep. Okay. Dr. Michael Bullock, it is such an honor to have you with us today.
It's my honor to be here. I truly appreciate not only this opportunity, but what you do in helping to reach those families and those listeners who have been affected by this community of child loss. What an important thing you're doing. So I appreciate your work and what you're doing as well.
Thank you, Michael. It is a privilege, just like I know it is for you with Miles's Mission.
Yeah. We never obviously expected to be doing what we're doing with Miles's Mission. We never anticipated being a part of a community that seems to be a lot larger than we ever could have imagined. But we're meeting some amazing people who are resilient, strong, tenacious, and not only moving forward in life, but also helping others through their pain and loss and suffering and grief. And so it's one of those situations where, for us, it started with our family not wanting to forget Miles's little life, not wanting to set him aside and have his life become insignificant. As a pastor, one of the things that I've learned as Christ spoke, he said, you die alone. But if you do go into the ground and die, you bear much fruit. And so we have seen much fruit because of what Miles's little life in short period of time here on earth has meant to so many other people. And so it's been an honor to serve them, to serve alongside of them, to help them and be helped by them. And so we are truly honored and appreciate it all.
Well said. And let's take a step back for those of you who maybe didn't hear his daughter Jennifer's episode. When Michael refers to his grandson, Miles, he was stillborn on October the 11th of 21. And Miles's Mission was then founded a year or so later. Is that
actually a year and a half? June of 23.
Okay. And I maybe got a little bit ahead of myself here. I usually give my guests a minute or two to just tell us anything about you and your family that you'd like to share that I didn't mention at the top of the episode. So I'll put that in your hands right now. If there's anything else that you would like to share about you or your family, now's the time.
Well, you're fine, because we really don't talk a lot about ourselves anyway, even though we are all in the public image and public figures. We're a very private family, very close-knit family. And so I would say the thing that is what fuels us is our faith, but also just the fact that we are such a united family. People never just ask how I'm doing. It's always, how's Kathy and the girls? Yeah. I mean, this has always been, in especially in the community of Zanesville, it's always, how's Kathy and the girls doing? Or if Kathy and I are together, how are the girls doing? And we feel bad because we never know to ask if those people's kids are doing well, or even if they have kids. But because we have been such a family figure, um, they just have always seen us as one entity. And so, in part, I really believe that's what got us through Miles's death, his stillbirth. I believe that that's what is continuing to propel us forward. And so, we're not that exciting, but we are. But we have a lot of experiences, and we've done a lot of things. And so, um, yeah, I mean, I could sit here and talk about all of the achievements, from degrees and what my wife does as a scientist, and what our oldest daughter did as an All-American in track and field, and Jen being a news anchor in Columbus. But I think the greater definition of our family is one. We are just one family together in everything that we do.
Well, that's so important, especially when you have to learn how to navigate through what you guys have been through. And I suspect that you do value the privacy that you spoke of, because you particularly and your daughter Jen are in very public places in your work. You as a pastor and Jen as a news anchor. So you've had to, both of you, walk through and navigate through this journey of grief in a very public way.
Yeah, and it's actually been a little uncomfortable early on.
I imagine.
Because we have been very private. And people, it's interesting. There are those who have no idea what to say, and so they say the wrong things. Those who know what to say don't say it enough. And because you are public, everyone comes up to you. And you know what it's like to have, you ever had a paper cut and you put a Band-Aid on, but it still stings, and you pull the Band-Aid off to redress it, put some more ointment on, and it's still sore, and then it throbs. And so every time we would have these conversations, it was pulling that Band-Aid off. It was reminding us of our pain. And even though people meant well, and it may have been the first time that someone to us has said anything, it's still difficult because we were reliving it on a regular basis in a public setting. And so we would have to keep our emotions in check. And I have to admit, there was an occasion that my emotions got the best of me because of something a man said that was very harsh. And he didn't know the situation. He thought Jen was off air because she was leaving her work, and he was very nasty in his comments. And so I stepped back, and I threatened to make a meeting between him and Jesus. And so
you stepped into protective daddy
mode. Yeah. And so it has been. It's been a challenge. But now, as we've wrapped our minds around being public figures and realizing that God was using this as a platform, we have gotten stronger in what we've been able to relate, the connections we've been able to make, the partnerships and supporters that we've united with. And so it's not easier, but it's more livable.
Yeah. Well, Michael, as a pastor, I am sure that you have ministered to a number of people who are grieving from any number of sources.
Mm-hmm.
When you guys lost Miles, what did you discover about grief that you didn't know before it became that personal?
Well, let me just say this. I had a younger brother who died at 47, and my wife had a brother who died at 50, her younger brother.
Mm-hmm.
We've both lost our fathers, a number of other relatives, grandparents, aunts, uncles. And as a pastor, I've done way too many funerals. During the COVID years, there was a 2-week period where I did 12 funerals.
Oh, wow.
And so, and I say that because obviously, yes, as a pastor, I'm associated with grief. As a family man, we've had our share of loss, but I don't know how to say this, but losing Miles, if you combined a number, not all, but a number of those deaths together, and the grief and the pain that you felt, my brother-in-law, father-in-law, Miles's death was exponentially more intense and deeper than all of those combined. And I don't know if it's because I held him and I begged God to have an Elisha moment, to resurrect him, a Jesus moment. I held his cheek to my cheek, trying to do that same thing of maybe the warmth will bring him to life. I breathed up his nostril. I mean, I was desperate. Because I think when someone 47 dies, it's painful, it hits you, but they've had a life. But when a physical child is there in your hands, but you can't see their eyes and they can't see yours, and all of a sudden there is no future, there is no promise, and all the things that you had thought you were going to be able to do has been wiped out. It's a lot more intense, and it's a lot deeper, because you feel like something was stripped away from you that was unfair, and that for some reason God decided that this is the route he was going to use for you to have a purpose, even if that in that moment you had no idea what it was going to be. And so, it was, we had to navigate some very difficult and very dark days. And Jen also, I don't know if she shared, but she had to have a hysterectomy. And so she had PTSD, she had postpartum, all the female hormonal issues. But then we had a son-in-law that we realized he lost his son. Jen has two other children that, they lost a brother. And then our other daughter, she lost a nephew, and her husband. And then our other grandkids, they lost a cousin, and on and on and on. And so it was very intense, very deep, very hard to navigate through that trauma.
Yeah, there is nothing easy about that. The word easy just kind of evaporates out of your vocabulary, especially, I don't know, sometimes even for years. And, interestingly enough, Michael, you are the first grandparent that I've had as a guest since I started this podcast. And, I thought about the fact that, in our culture, when parents lose a child and their surviving siblings, those siblings are known as the forgotten mourners.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons, I think. I started thinking, I wonder if sometimes grandparents feel the same way, because rightfully so, the attention turns to the parents who lost that child.
Yeah.
But what you just described about the grief that you have gone through and that your family has gone through, do you see any similarities there when we talk about those forgotten mourners? Do you feel like that maybe in some respects that might apply to grandparents?
Well, the thing is, Greg, that it's a two-sided coin for grandparents, that you're not only grieving the loss of the grandchild, but you're grieving that you can't help your child.
Yeah, great point.
And that's the part that I think people don't realize either.
Yeah.
And that we spent so much energy trying to bring Jen back out of her abyss.
Right.
And so much effort, because my wife, she would just cry out to God, and she would say to me, we can't lose Jen too. We can't lose Jen too. I'm not going to lose my daughter. And in all of that, we would see people and they would ask us, how's Jen doing? And, I would say, she's getting there. My son-in-law, he's struggling. Jen's sister is having a hard time. We're having a hard time. And you could see the confused look over their faces, like, huh?
Yeah.
As if, we weren't grieving. And so, it's very true. One of the things that we have found with Miles's mission is we've been contacted by people, and because of the book being written by a grandfather, we have had more grandparents who have contacted us to thank us, because we're telling their story as well. Not just ours, not just Jen's, not just the parents, but their story. And that's the very same thing that they say is what you just said. they have, in a sense, been forgotten. Not intentionally,
Of course.
but any loss effect. I mean, think about any funeral you go to, whether it's an older parent, some other relative, you go to the funeral home and everybody's gathered around, they're supporting each other, they're caring about each other. But the emphasis is on the people who sit in the front row, those most immediately impacted. And so that's the natural course of what we deal with in death. But in this situation, because there was no funeral, all the attention is on Jen, and it's not wrong. It's just everyone else is forgotten. And so even when you're around other family members, how's Jen doing? She's getting there, but we're struggling.
Yeah.
And then it's like, why are you struggling? I'm like, why wouldn't we be? And so then we have to tell this story. And so, yeah, it's hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate your transparency there, Michael. And it sort of brings another question to mind. Do you feel like in our do you feel like our culture minimizes child loss when it results from stillbirth or miscarriage? And why do you think that might be the case?
That is definitely the case. As we've gotten more and more into Miles's mission, we are learning how few organizations and people in healthcare, mental health industry, have put their attentions towards stillbirth legislation. We need so much in the legislative side of things as far as funding to do research, to find out why so many of these things are happening. And then there's a racial disparity. Women of color, it happens 2.5 to 3 times more often than any other culture or race. And part of why it's not talked about is hospitals say they don't want to talk about the death. It's also a very touching subject because people don't know how to navigate when there's a loss of a child in stillbirth or neonatal or even a miscarriage. There's no identifying factor. How do you reference that? When a child dies at 5 years of age, there's a sorrow. But because there was a little bit of a lifespan, there's more recognition and awareness. And there's going to be more research, whether it's because a child died of cancer, an automobile accident, SIDS, whatever it may be. But when people haven't necessarily seen that child and held that child or seen a life in that child, it's kind of shoved aside. And in our culture, unfortunately, because of some of the conversations around abortion, people don't see those children even as living, even though the CDC says there's different stages of gestation, that from 0 to 19 weeks is miscarriage, 20 to 39 weeks is stillbirth, and 40 weeks to 6 months is neonatal. That's not a law. That's just an observation by the CDC that they use as a guideline. But there's no law in place that says those stages are factual for a doctor to sign off on them. And so we have set those things aside, but we are meeting organizations along with what we're doing and trying to enhance the awareness so that people are starting to pay attention that these little lives were wanted by these families. And these moms, dads, grandparents, sisters, brothers, nieces, nephews, cousins, they are suffering. They are hurting. They are in pain. They are grieving. They are real people who had a real child that they did not get to have and take home. And so as long as we keep having people like you helping us to be a voice, to bring awareness to it, we can move forward and do some great things and change the narrative.
Yeah, and that's what needs to happen. The narrative does need to be changed about the impact of the death of a child on the parents and other family members, no matter how old, whether it was a miscarriage, stillbirth, or if they died when they were 26 years old.
Exactly.
I think our culture just does not really recognize the impact. And I'm really glad that the cultural battle that we have about the value of life. And I do think that plays into it because we have, through a lot of the legislation and a lot of choices and decisions that we've made as states and as nations and as individuals, that life is not valued like it was at one time, and we need to return to that. Don't There are a lot of ways that has to happen, but I'm so glad you brought that up because I think that is critically important.
Yeah. Well, it's not even just in the stillbirth and miscarriage. You look at why these young people are shooting each other and killing each other or committing suicide or overdosing. It's like you said, we have devalued life and the preciousness of life. Each of us has been given a time period. We have a life. The Bible says, we have these 70 years, and if 10 years beyond that, it's a blessing. But not everybody gets the 70 years either.
True.
And some of these situations where lives are taken, it's because they just don't care. We've lost a sense of the dignity of living and the value of each person. And, I don't know why totally. I mean, yes, you can blame social media, technology, you can blame video games, all of these things. But as a pastor, a lot of it for me is we've also gotten away from the consistency of attending church and being part of a church family. I see that with families who struggle. Do we take our kids to the baseball game on Sunday, or do we go to youth group? Do we go to the football game on Sunday or to the youth group? Do we go to the soccer game on Sunday or to the youth group? And so when you have children attending church 10 out of 52 weeks a year, the influence is not going to be the sanctity of life. But what you're telling them is that the other things of life are more important, the competitive elements, the winning and not losing, becoming a professional athlete. And so all of a sudden, the pressure and the intensity of all that comes on these families. And so when you do lose a baby, it's less valued because life itself is devalued. And I think that that's part of the horrible trend that we're falling into as a nation.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's
Sorry,
very
I didn't mean to
unfortunate.
preach on all that.
No. I am glad that you shared that because I am in wholehearted agreement with you, and it needs to be talked about. Yeah. When we were talking a few minutes ago about the personal impact that losing Miles had, it triggered a memory of me reading, and you described what I think you were describing a very surreal few minutes that Sunday morning when Jen walked into your office. Why don't you just kind of take it from there and tell us a little bit about what happened that morning, that back to October 11th of 2021, because I think it speaks very clearly of the immediate impact of the loss of a child on every aspect of your being. So why don't you just pick it up from there, Michael?
Okay. I don't know how much you want me to share, but I'll share this with you.
We'll limit it to about 4 hours. How about that?
Okay, I can do that. Well, Jen came into my office and sat here, and her first words were, "He's gone." And my first thought was her husband. And so I'm like, who's gone? And when she said, "My baby," I said, "Jen, you don't." "Yes, I do, Daddy. He's gone." And she began to cry. How do you describe feeling helpless? There's no real definition to define when your brain and your heart separate. That's the best thing I can say, because my brain was trying to figure out what to say, but my heart had gone down into my stomach.
Yeah.
And at that moment, I'm trying to prepare for church. I mean, we had people outside of my office doors. They were getting ready to start our worship music that I have to go into the sanctuary. And so here's all this hustle and bustle of a morning church service. And she's sitting here. And it was as if all of a sudden the noise was gone. And I could hear my heart pounding, but my head was just spinning with, am I her pastor or her father?
Yeah.
What do I say? And I said, "Okay, Jen, sit here until you're ready to come in. Make sure everybody's in the sanctuary. And then if you want to come in, come in. I've got to go. but we'll talk about this after church. I said, we'll pray about this. She goes, I know, Daddy, but he's gone. So I walked out of my office, went to the sanctuary, sat in the front row where I always sit, and I honestly didn't hear a song being sung. We went through our offering and everything. And when our worship leader looked at me to come to the stage, I didn't know what to do. I was numb. And as I was greeting everyone and dismissing the kids, Jen had made her way into the sanctuary. And that entire message, I had to fight every part of my physical being because I wanted to go down and hold her and be with her. But I had an entire congregation of people who had no idea of what had just transpired.
Right.
And
And
so,
you've got to preach this same message
yeah,
that you had been preparing for all week
yeah,
in this condition.
yeah. And that's the part that people, and I'll put a plug in for my colleagues, for pastors. We at times deserve Oscars because we have to act. We really do have to act. I had to act as if nothing had happened prior to me coming into the sanctuary, because not only was it my responsibility to preach to these people and teach them and share the word of God with them, to feed them, to nurture them, to encourage them, do everything that I've always done as a pastor from a pulpit, but I had to do it in a manner that they could not sense even that there was something wrong with me. Because the minute that would have happened, they would have not heard the message and started thinking, what's wrong with him? What's going on with Pastor today? And so I had to put on the best performance of my life in that moment. And even after the sermon was done, I had to spend time with those same people. Jen, when I prayed, she had already left the sanctuary, so she went right back to my office. And I had to hang out with these people in fellowship. And I was trying to get to my little girl, and I couldn't. And so that was probably one of the most difficult things that I've ever had to do in my life. I preached my youngest brother's funeral. I preached his funeral. And that wasn't as hard as that day that I had to preach looking down at her and seeing her crying the entire service. And I had to pretend like nothing had happened to my little girl.
I can't imagine.
Yeah. Well, that's what I said. There's things that, God puts us through that aren't for anybody else. They are your walk, your testimony, your purpose. And that's why here at our church, I try to tell people, stop judging so much. Just because someone else is doing this or not doing that, or because it takes them longer to grieve than it took you, just stop it. Because God has a purpose for all of us. And every one of us has our lane that we're supposed to stay in. And so, not every pastor is going to do what I did, because not every pastor who was asked to do what I did.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing is that makes it harder, is you can't even reference anyone because most people don't know what that's like.
Yeah. Michael, I suspect that most people who are listening, and when they found out that you're a pastor, there are a lot of preconceived ideas that go along with thinking about somebody who's a pastor. And one of those things is, I think most people think that obviously you study scripture probably more than I do. You spend more time in the Word. Obviously you're responsible for the people under your care. And so they would think that Dr. Bullock knows a whole lot more about God than I do. So I'm just going to ask you a very personal question.
Yeah.
What did you learn about God on your grief journey that you didn't know about him?
Here's the thing. Even if I do know more about God than you do, I don't know everything about God.
Right.
And what you learn is, it's funny. In seminary, they teach you all those righteous words: justification, dispensation, hermeneutical, sovereignty. Until you go through certain experiences, you have no idea of what the word sovereign really, really means. And I would say that's the word I would use, if you ask me to say, give me one word, just one word of what you learned about God, and it's that word, that's sovereign. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the simplest of definitions, it means one who rules, right?
Right.
Well, see, that's the thing about definitions. They are defined based upon someone's intellect, but they're redefined by a person's experience of it. So my experience of the word sovereign means that God is completely and totally in control of my life. So when his word says he's ordered my steps, or he's established my days, he's numbered my days, numbered the hairs of my head, all of these things, you begin to realize how in control God really is. And so when I looked back at the journey that we went through, the months afterwards, and I saw, if I could just real quick share a story to prove my point here.
Sure.
When Jen was in the hospital, she'd gone in on a Sunday night, and she wasn't going to get discharged till a Wednesday because of the hysterectomy. So my wife and I, well, there was still some protocol in place at the hospital for COVID. And so her husband, Gerald, suggested that she put him and my wife on her list. She was only allowed 2 people. And Jen's like, how can I choose between my mom and my dad? And Gerald said, your dad can come as your pastor, because Jen was under her married name. Well, when I showed up at the hospital, the young lady at the reception desk who was checking everybody's credentials, we walked in and she looked up. She goes, oh my gosh, Dr. Bullock. And I said, okay. She goes, I was one of your students. I used to teach at a Bible college.
Okay.
For 20 years. And of course, 20 years, all these students, you don't remember. So anyway, she gives me a card, basically carte blanche, to go anywhere in the hospital I wanted to go.
Oh, wow.
So we go up to Jen's room, and of course, I'm pretending to be her pastor. And the nurse comes in, and the nurse kind of looks at me, and she asked if we wanted to see Miles. So she left, got Miles out of the morgue, wheeled him in, and she kept staring. And I finally said, is there a problem? Because I thought she was going to tell me I had to leave or whatever. She goes, are you Dr. Bullock? I goes, yes. She goes, I thought so. My sister, she went to school, and you were her favorite instructor, professor. She loved you, da, da, da. She went on and on. You tell me anything you need. And so what we did when we looked back, we realized in the deepest, darkest, most painful thing in our lives, God showed up because he not only led us in the hospital, but he opened a door for us to not even be concerned about being there. And then when we got to the room, there was a nurse. But even for Gerald to have the wisdom to say, put your mom on the list so your dad can come as your pastor. And then let us know that, listen, Greg, I'm telling you, God knows your tomorrow better than you know today.
Absolutely.
And so when I say the thing that I look back and learn and still learn, and to be honest with you, it's calmed a lot of my anxieties to know how sovereign God is, that he really does control my life. Because if I have something down in the future and I start to get anxious about it, it's like, whoa, stop. He's already there. He's already put everything in place. He's put the people in place. He's put the situation in place. He's already taken care of the issues. So just enjoy today. Go out there, enjoy it, breathe, and stop being so overwhelmed.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think when you find yourself in those life-defining moments, losing someone that close, losing a child, is certainly one of those, if not probably the most traumatic thing that a parent can experience in life, and certainly what you've described for a grandparent as well. And I think it's in those moments that everything that you know about God in your relationship and what you've learned through Scripture just becomes a whole lot more personal.
Oh yeah.
At a level that you probably would never have tasted outside of that. And it brings me back to something that I read. It said that, it's one thing to know what you believe, but it's another to believe what you know.
One of the things in the book, I share this in the sense that as Christians, sometimes we become a little lazy, complacent.
You think?
Yeah, but we start having faith in faith. And what I mean by
Yeah,
that is we take every day things that we don't think about, like starting the car
right,
or the fact that we even get up. We just go about our day. But in those cataclysmic moments, they remind us to have faith in God.
right.
And so that's the sovereignty. And so all of a sudden, you're no longer complacent. You become invigorated. You become purposeful, intentional. You've rekindled that fire to have faith in God again.
Yeah, well said. I want to give you an opportunity to just tell our listeners a little bit more about Miles's mission and what it is that you guys do in your community and what your future purposes and goals are from that. It's a nonprofit, right?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And if you go to www.milesmission.com, you can look on our website and see a lot of what we do. But our whole mission is around three things: enhancing awareness of pregnancy and infant loss, providing resources, because there's a lot of resources out there. I always say, for example, moms need something to hold because they went in the hospital thinking they were coming out holding something, and they don't. And so there are organizations that provide bears or some kind of a stuffed animal. So we help in those regards. We point people to them. Then something after the fact, let's say down the road, a month later, and mom's still grieving. Well, there's boxes that organizations give. So that's another resource. And then books, other things that people counseling. And so we provide resources. And then our third is to support the families who have suffered through pregnancy and infant loss. And our tagline, if you will, is because every life matters, that we take and value life, as we talked about earlier. And so what Miles's mission is doing is, yes, it started locally, but we are expanding tremendously. We've actually become a hub for a lot of other organizations to meet and to use our resources, and we use their resources. Putting cuddle cots. A cuddle cot is a cooling bassinet that the stillborn baby can stay in the room with the mom, whereas Jen had to ask for Miles to come out of the morgue, and then he'd have to go back into the morgue. He could have stayed in her room with a cuddle cot. And so part of our work is making sure that hospitals have cuddle cots, and we're working with another organization to do that. We are continuing to work with hospitals, because one of the things, especially here in Ohio, is there's varying degrees of patient care when it comes to pregnancy and infant loss. So we call it PAIL, P-A-I-L. And so we are trying to standardize the different policies and practices from hospital to hospital. And so we are working to standardize those things. And so what our future looks like is being able to bring that standardization to hospitals, to have them be recognized or designated as different levels of care for pregnancy and infant loss families, to provide bereavement suites in these hospitals, but also to continue to bring organizations together to be a bigger voice, a louder voice, a more impactful voice for this community of loss. And so we're only 9 months old, but we have reached through either cuddle cots or partnerships, organizations in California, Arizona, Texas, Arkansas, Georgia, Florida, and now South Carolina, and also Indiana. And so whether it be a partnership or working and functioning through other avenues, we are becoming more and more expansive. And we just saw that the organization that makes cuddle cots over in Europe, is where they originated. They have put us on their website. They put us on their Facebook page, and they've reached out to us, and we're actually going to be meeting with them to continue to increase their business here in the U.S. as well. So I guess you can say we are starting to be international also. So yeah, we are. It's amazing what's happening and how fast it's happening and what God has done in this short period of time.
Well, that is such important work, and it is very obvious from all that you just described that God is all over this.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I'm so thankful that there are organizations out there like you guys that are doing this to help change that narrative that we talked about earlier in this, in our conversation. For those of you who are listening today that heard us mention earlier in our conversation the book that Michael has recently written, I want to bring our attention back to that before we go. And that book is entitled, Even Now I Know, A Journey from Grief to Gratitude. And that book can be found on Amazon and most other outlets who sell books, period, not just Christian books. I'd like to just give you a minute to just speak about your purpose was in writing that book, and if someone picks it up, what they can expect to read from it, Michael.
Well, the first thing is it was God inspired. I wanted to share our journey because what Jen did not get, I wanted to bring attention to. And so we share in the first part of the book our journey, what we went through, what we dealt with, the grief part. But then I share in the back part of the book the story of Martha and Jesus when Lazarus died and what grief does to us. But also the fact that you can be grateful, even in the most disastrous of moments of your life, to be grateful. When you and I talked several weeks ago about the podcast and coming on, you said three things, or something about three things that coexist. It's hope, joy, and grief. And you asked me at that time, how do those components work together? How do they coexist? Well, one of the things that the book does is it reminds us that all three are emotions, and that in those emotions, external events stimulate them, and we can't always control them. You see a picture of your son, and it stimulates tears or laughter or sorrow, whatever it may be. So it affects you. And so those external things still affect us and continue to develop us in our emotions. But most important of all, the thing that I try to share in the book is to be encouraged because of the fact that you are still feeling your emotions. You're still working through your emotions. You are still in a place where you're not numb anymore when you start crying and laughing at the same time. Matter of fact, there's a part of the book that I share about that moment, and I used a word called euphoric grief. I made it up. It's not a clinical word, but euphoric grief, because you're at the height of this elation, but at the same time, you can't, you're crying because what you want, you can't have, but you also know that you had something that you wanted. And so that's what the book does. That's part of what the Grief to Gratitude is all about, being able to find that laughter again in the midst of your tears, and to realize that God was in the midst of all of it. And that we know if you are a Christian, if you're a believer, if you have accepted Christ Jesus as your Lord and Savior, there's a component in you that will always know that God has you covered, and God loves you, and God will always be there for you. He has your back.
Well said. This book offers hope. Thank you so much for pouring that part of yourself and your grief journey into a book like this that has the potential to affect and bring hope to the lives of a lot of people who are listening today and beyond that. Thank you and Jen and your family for what you're doing with Miles' mission. And if you're listening right now and you're driving and don't have the ability to jot down these websites or the book, if you will check out the summary section of Michael's episode, you'll find a direct link there for both. Michael, thank you so much for being our guest today and sharing your story.
Thank you. And it was truly an honor to spend some time with you, to be encouraged by you, and continue to see what you're doing to continue to help us all. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. It is a privilege. If you find our podcast meaningful, we invite you to follow us so that you can automatically receive the latest episodes. Also, we'd like to invite you to contact us and talk with us about sharing your story on a future episode, because every story is important and matters to God. Please reach out via email at hope@emptychairendeavor.com. That's hope@emptychairendeavor.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening